Welcome to the Cold Case Christianity broadcast, the only Christian case-making program hosted by a cold case homicide detective. J. Warner Wallace has been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Court TV, and Dateline. For more information about Jim's work and the case for Christianity, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. Now, here's your host, J. Warner Wallace.
Thanks for joining us at Cold Case Christianity. I'm J. Warner Wallace. Today we're going to talk about a piece of evidence that I think is often overlooked, but I think is of critical importance as we examine whether or not naturalism can explain the universe in which we live. Today we're going to look at a piece of evidence that I think points to the existence of God. And that is, the explanation for what we all experience as consciousness. Our own sense of our ability to consciously perceive who we are, think about the world around us, feel certain reactions to certain events, certain sensations, desires, emotions. This experience we have of our own conscious life is really kind of difficult to explain from a materialistic perspective. Let me back up a little bit and explain what I mean. I've recently written a book called God's Crime Scene. And it really is an effort to look at the entire universe the same way we might look at a crime scene from an investigative perspective. And here's what I mean. I take an approach that is really similar to walking into any death scene and trying to determine if, in fact, the best explanation for this scene is a murder, or is it perhaps an accident, or a natural death, or a suicide. Well, how do we determine whether a death is a murder rather than the other three kinds of deaths that really don't involve criminal investigators like detectives? Well, one of the simplest ways of doing this is a game I call inside or outside the room. Let me explain. If I can explain everything in the room, all the evidence in the room, by staying in the room, there's a good chance it's not a murder. Here's what I mean. If I've got a gunshot injury and a pistol lying on the floor, but that pistol actually is registered to the victim, belonged to the victim lives alone, there's only fingerprints and DNA in the room from the victim, including on the gun itself, and there's no sign of an entry, well then I can explain everything inside the room by staying inside the room for an explanation. That gun was probably there the whole time, it belongs to the victim, this is either going to be an accidental or a suicide. On the other hand, if that pistol does not belong to the victim, as a matter of fact, there's unknown DNA or unknown fingerprints on that gun, and maybe there's bloody footprints that lead outside the room. Okay, wait, now this is changing. Now I cannot explain what's in the room by staying in the room for an explanation. I'd have to go outside the room to explain what's in the room, and anytime that happens, everything shifts. You now have to really consider the reasonable inference of an intruder. And when that happens, now you've got to shift the entire thing from a natural or an accidental death to the reasonable inference of an intruder involved in a homicide. Now, this little game we play of inside or outside the room may sound like it's a purely academic exercise or something that detectives alone do, but in reality, you could use this same approach to determine if the most reasonable explanations for the universe we live are purely natural. I was an atheist until I was 35. And during most of that time, I would have told you that the only thing I needed to explain everything in the universe were the natural attributes of the universe itself. Space, time, matter, the laws of physics and chemistry that govern such things. And really, that's all I would need in order to explain everything I see in the evidence. But if you really start to examine more carefully, 8 pieces of evidence that I look at in God's Crime Scene, the book I just finished writing, I think that really you've got to ask yourself, can you stay inside the room of the natural universe to explain everything that's inside the room of the natural universe? It turns out there are 8 things in 4 broad categories. And I really don't think you can explain these things well by staying inside the room. I think actually the better explanation is outside the room of naturalism. And that's what we're going to take a look at today. We're going to look at one of the 8 things that I think everyone has a burden to explain. And that's another important point. Sometimes it's said that we as theists are the only ones who have to offer an explanation. We propose there's something that cannot be seen, God, And if we're going to offer that there's this invisible God that's in control of the universe and has created the universe, isn't the burden on us? Well, wait a minute. There are whenever time you have any set of evidences in a crime scene, really, whoever's offering the explanation for those 8 set of evidences or 8 pieces of evidence, or if there's 100 pieces of evidence, whatever it is, has the burden of explaining, of providing me an explanation that unifies all the evidence, that most thoroughly and most completely explains the evidence in the scene. Well, that means that these 8 things that I'm offering, and I'll just cover them briefly for you right now, that those are that we are in a universe that has a beginning. We see the appearance of fine-tuning in this universe directed toward life. We see the origin of life from non-life. We see the appearance of biology that even atheists would recognize, like Richard Dawkins, the appearance of a design in biology. And we also have consciousness, which we're going to talk about today, and free agency, the ability to select freely and make choices freely as free agents. And we have the existence of objective, transcendent moral truths we have to explain. And finally, we have the persistent problem of evil in the universe. These are 8 things that all of us have a burden to explain. Can your worldview actually explain these 8 pieces of evidence? If you're an atheist, then naturalism, your philosophically natural worldview, has to account for these 8 items. And if you're a theist of one stripe or another, your supernatural theistic worldview has to account for these, and including evil. So all of us have a burden to explain how this universe we live in and everything we see in it could exist and be explained by our respective worldviews. Now, today what we're going to do is take a look at one of the 8 pieces of evidence. And it's a difficult piece of evidence because most of the work that's been done in this area has been highly philosophical. And if you're not a student of the literature or of the work that's been done in the last 100 years on this topic, it can be a tough read. And we're going to talk about something called the problem of mind. And the reason why it's called the problem of mind, that's a label that's been given to it largely by philosophical naturalists, people who do not believe you in anything other than the physical universe. Well, if this is the case, we have to really take a look at why this would be a problem for physicalism, for materialism, and I'll explain why I think it would be a problem. If the atheist view of the universe is true, then the universe is nothing more than space, time, and matter, and all the laws that govern such things, physics and chemistry. Now, if that's the case, here's the problem you have. If the universe truly is purely physical, material, made of these things we typically identify as the natural realm, that might account for brains, because brains are purely physical. But can it account for minds? Where do we get the non-material, non-physical experience of consciousness? How does this emerge from a purely physical process if an atheistic view of the world is actually true, an atheistic view of the universe? Here's the problem. Atheists who propose that only natural laws and the natural elements of space, time, and matter are required to explain everything in the universe are by their very nature monists, in the sense they believe in one physical reality. They aren't dualists in the sense that they believe in both a physical and non-physical realm. They believe in a purely physical realm. And if that's the case, you might be able to account for the physical brain. But the mind becomes a problem. And that's why so much literature, if you just do a Google search on literature, either reports, surveys, studies, books that have been written on the quote-unquote problem of mind, or the mind-body problem, quote-unquote, you will see the literature is pretty robust, because this really is a problem for those who would try to explain mind from a purely physical perspective. Well, what we're going to do after the break is we're going to talk about whether or not you can actually call one the other. Do we really have minds? Do we have consciousness? Or do we really just have brains that give us the illusion of consciousness, the illusion of mind? And could we really say, truthfully, that your brain is identical to your mind? If we can, then I think you can explain consciousness from inside the room of the natural physical universe. But if brain is not the same as mind, we really have to look for something that's non-material that could really account for why we all possess minds. And that's what we're going to do right after the break.
In addition to Jim's daily blog and weekly podcasts and videos, Jim continues to write books designed to help you become a better Christian casemaker. At coldcasechristianity.com, you'll find a link to Cold Case Christianity, a homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels, and Alive, a cold case approach to the resurrection. These resources will help you defend what you believe and share it with others. Connect with Cold Case Christianity on social media. Visit the Cold Case Christianity homepage and click the social media icons on the top right toolbar. Jim is active on Facebook and Twitter, posting the best apologetics articles from over 250 Christian blogs around the country. You'll also find links to Jim's Instagram, Pinterest, and Google Plus accounts, along with the link to the Cold Case Christianity YouTube page. Stay connected with Cold Case Christianity and become a better Christian casemaker.
Okay, in the book God's Crime Scene, I actually argue that there are 5 ways that the brain is not identical to the mind. Now, why is that important? Well, think about it. If you're wondering if somebody is who they say they are, or if you're trying to figure out, for example, if a suspect is guilty of a crime, and you've got somebody in your sights, maybe you think Jim Wallace is guilty of something, maybe you think I'm guilty of a theft. And so what you have to do then is say, well, somebody was seen at the scene of the crime, and he identified himself as Jim. And he left some fingerprints on the scene, and he took $5 that wasn't his. And people identified him, and they can describe him, but you don't know really who this Jim guy is. Well, at some point in your investigation, you come up with a Jim Wallace that actually might be the person you're looking for. Well, how do you know if Jim Wallace is the Jim who committed the crime? Well, one way is to develop an identity relationship. In other words, are all the attributes of Jim Wallace identical to all the attributes of Jim, the unknown suspect who took the $5? So, for example, if you could describe him as a 54-year-old man with white hair, well, that's true of Jim Wallace. That's also true of Jim the Crook. If you could describe him about 6 feet tall, about 185 pounds, well, that's true of Jim Wallace. That's also, if you actually even had the fingerprints or DNA from the scene of the theft, and you discovered that they were identical to the DNA and fingerprints of Jim Wallace, well, now you know that every attribute of Jim Wallace is identical to every attribute of Jim the Crook at the scene. And when that happens, you're now in a place where you can say you have a one-on-one identity relationship. You know that Jim Wallace is Jim the thief. And that's important because when all the attributes of one thing on one side of the equation match all the attributes of the thing on the other side of the equation, you now know you have the same guy. Now, the question, of course, is, could we do this with brain and mind? Are brain and mind identical? If they are, well, then we can explain mind from inside the room of the universe, because we can get brains from the physical stuff of the universe and all the neurons that fire in brains, all the chemistry that occurs in brains, all that physical activity. We could also explain from the physical inside the room of the universe, the physical universe. So if we can say that brain is equal to mind, we're done. We can explain it from inside the room. On the other hand, if mind is not brain, that changes everything. Now we can't explain mind from inside the room of the natural universe. And if that's the case, we got to look for another explanation. I think there are 5 ways in which the attributes of the brain are not the attributes of the mind. And remember, in order for one to be the other, all the attributes have to be the same. I'll show you 5 ways they aren't very quickly. Take a look. Here's the first one. The first one is that there's a difference between what can be publicly known and what can be privately known. Here's what I mean. If we were to take a look at someone's memory, and an example, well, I asked a question. You asked a question about me, for example, and you said, hey, well, how about this? Let's use a better example. Let's use Ben Carson. Ben Carson, and forget about his political aspirations. Ben Carson is a neurosurgeon. He's probably the most famous neurosurgeon I can think of right now. So let's use Ben Carson. If you were to ask Ben about his memories related to his, his mom growing up, he would have certain thoughts. and certain recollections, certain feelings, and connections between all the events that have occurred in his life related to his mom. But those are private. You could not open his brain, open his head, look inside, find his brain, and locate and tell us from just looking physically at his brain about those memories and all the emotional connections and all the feelings and recollections he's having related to connecting these events. Now, you might be able to find where neurons are firing in the brain, but the only way you'd know what those neurons represent would be if you asked him to report to you. And even then, there's a lot of depth. You'd have to ask more and more depth about the emotions and feelings and memories that come back. It turns out that you can access physical things publicly, like his brain. So I can see where there's chemical activity, I can see neurons firing. But if you want to know what he's thinking, if you want to know about his mental properties, the mental entities of thoughts, he's going to have to expose those to you because they're privately held. This is a key difference between brains and minds. Brains are publicly accessed and minds are not. Minds are privately accessed. Let me give you another example of a difference between brain and mind. You can measure a brain. You can measure it in terms of its volume, its weight, its mass, its height, its depth. You can put it on a scale and get its weight. These are things you can do with physical items like brains. But of course, just quite obviously, you cannot measure in the same way mental properties. They don't have weight. You can't say you can't say what's the weight of that thought, or how long is that idea. You cannot measure these kinds of things in the same way. This is yet another way, another example of a difference between mental properties and physical properties. That's important to look at. And those kinds of differences do make a difference when we assess whether or not the brain is the mind. Let me give you a third one. Here's an example. Let's say I was thinking, I was in a house, I'm in the room, and I hear what I think is a burglar outside. And I'm, this is all police work, so I'm sorry, bear with me. You hear the burglar, and now I'm obsessed thinking about the burglar, and is my door locked, and can I protect myself? I've got tons of thoughts about the burglar. You'll notice something that's different between the physical burglar and my thoughts. It turns out this highlights a difference between all physical items and mental properties and mental entities. The difference between physical entities and mental entities is simply this. Physical entities, well, your thoughts, let's go start with mental entities first. Mental entities are always about something else. What are you thinking about? Your thoughts, your mental entities are always directed or dependent upon something else as a referent. But that something else, the burglar, is not dependent on something else. It just is. The burglar is. And this is a key difference between physical properties and mental properties. Physical entities and mental entities. Mental entities have what I would call an aboutness because they're always about something else. But physical things are not about something else. They just are. They have what I call an isness. So it's this aboutness and this isness is a third way that physical properties are different. The brain itself, being a physical object, is different than your mental entities. Let's go to a fourth one. Let's say you're wrong about the burglar. The burglar really isn't even there. Well, one thing you can say is that there might be the existence of the burglar might be disputable, but your thoughts, even your errant thoughts about the burglar, are not disputable. You can be wrong about the burglar, but there's no disputing the fact you're having thoughts, errant thoughts about the burglar. And this is another difference between mental entities and physical entities. You can be incorrect about something physical, but your thoughts are indisputable. And that's something that separates the two again, brain from mind. Let me go one last one. Let's say you're part of a SWAT team, and I've been part of a SWAT team, and you are being trained about everything that could be known physically about a shooting you might get into, a tactical entry into a house. You've been trained physically in how to use your weapon. You've been trained to know what happens to the physical body if you someone assaults you, or if you have to do a shooting. You've actually been trained to even talk about, to even know what might happen to your physical response to your body. You know, if you are involved in a shooting, what it'll do to your nervous system. You even have some physical idea of the layout. I could teach you all there is to know about this physical experience. I could even teach you about the nervous reaction, a nervous system reaction in your own body. But even if you knew all there was to know by examining those physical issues, those commonly seen, commonly accessible physical truths, you still wouldn't know all there is to know until you're involved in the shooting yourself and have a whole series of subjective emotional responses and thoughts related to your activity in the shooting. Why? Because the physical properties of such a thing are objective and can be accessed very impersonally. But your experience of this, your thoughts related to it, are very personal and subjective. And this objective, impersonal, and subjective personal difference is yet another contrasting difference between brain and mind, physical entities and mental entities, or mental entities. And so here again, we've now listed 5 things. Let me give you a diagram. By the way, all of these illustrations are from a talk I do on God's crime scene. So if you ever are in an area where you hear, my calendar's posted at coldcasechristianity.com. I'd love to meet you personally. If you ever see that I'm in your area, I'd love you to come out, because the presentation I do is very robust, and I think it will make better sense, kind of making visual some of these ideas. So I'm kind of using a few of my visual aids here in this presentation tonight. But I want you at least to see and kind of have some idea of kind of visualizing the difference. Let's take a look at this chart now, which you'll see here on the screen, that highlights 5 ways that the mind is different than the brain. One is measurable, one is measureless, one is public, one is private, one is it really is, the other is about. One is incorrect, one's indisputable, one's impersonal, one's personal. These are, and so clearly the problem you have here is that you cannot say accurately that the brain is identical to the mind. And if that's the case, you know you have something in the purely physical universe, if atheism is true, that is not purely physical. It seems to be kind of an odd extra fact about the universe that is really impossible to explain if all you have are the physical elements we've already described. We'll take a quick break, and when we come back, I'll show you where I think this actually points to the existence of God.
Be sure to download the free Cold Case Christianity app from the iTunes Store and the Android Marketplace. The Cold Case Christianity app puts all the resources from coldcasechristianity.com in the palm of your hand. You can read the daily blog, listen to podcasts, and watch videos from within the application. And Jim uses the app to send direct messages to fans of Cold Case Christianity. The app will also link you to all Cold Case Christianity social media and provide you with a direct connection to J. Warner Wallace. Download the app today and become a better Christian casemaker.
Okay, we've only got a few minutes left, and I want to kind of summarize why I think this is pretty powerful evidence. Look, in the end, if physicalism cannot explain mind, and I want to tell you, we didn't cover many of the ways that naturalists would try to explain mind by staying inside the room. And this is really a very detailed explanations they would sometimes give. Either they would argue that mind is an illusion. They would argue that maybe I could attribute it to some kind of quantum physics thing happening in the mind, which really is not a better solution, it's a worse solution. They will sometimes try to identify it with behaviors or other explanations. And as a matter of fact, I've gone through each and every lengthy explanation of how atheists have tried to explain mind from inside the room of the universe. What I've done is I've got my copy here of God's crime scene so you can see it. It's pretty beat up. But the point is, I actually have a secondary investigation in which the back of the book I go through all the alternative explanations, page after page, with lots of explanations, with drawings that'll help you to see why explanations from inside the room just don't get it done. If, however, there is a conscious mind that is the creator of the universe, has fine-tuned it for life, has provided the information we see in the genome, in DNA, in which to create life from non-life, and this mind is creating life in its own image, then one of the things that we might just have as human beings, created in the image of our creator, is the thing we call mind. Now, why does that really kind of help us to kind of look at the evidence in the room and really, basically it forces us to go outside the room for an explanation. If the room we're talking about is just the natural realm of the universe with all space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry that govern these things, well, that stuff cannot get you mind. You've got to go outside that natural realm in order to explain that. And this is not by itself, I would say, irrefutable evidence for the existence of God. Not by any stretch. But what this is yet another piece of a larger cumulative case for the existence of God. And when assembled this way, I think it's very, very powerful. It's going to be hard to explain how to get both consciousness and free agency in a purely physical universe that is governed by physical cause and effect relationships and nothing else. And that's why I think the better explanation for all 8 pieces of evidence in the room is actually outside the room. And if that's the case, it forces us to reconsider our commitments to philosophical naturalism. And that's what happened to me. As I examined all that evidence and I realized the better explanation was outside the room, I had to rethink the very way I've been explaining this evidence for years, the very way I've been thinking about this evidence for years. So the idea that nothing supernatural could ever occur, and even the elements of Scripture that I would read and say, well, gosh, I could believe that Jesus lived and some of this history, but I can't believe miracles. Really? Well, if there is a God of the universe, the most dramatic miracle that God ever performed was in Genesis 1, creating everything from nothing. If we've got good reason to believe there is a personal deity outside the natural universe that is the cause of the natural universe and is responsible for that level of miracle, the stuff you see in the New Testament is really child's play by comparison. That's why I think this is important evidence, something we need to master, we need to understand so we can help make the case to those of us, the people who are still in our world, who don't accept this. I've got family, for example, that still reject these claims. But if you think carefully about the evidence, you'll realize it's really impossible to describe, for example, a mind by staying inside the room of the natural universe. I hope that was helpful to you. We'll talk more about this in coming weeks, right here at Cold Case Christianity.
Thanks for joining us at the Cold Case Christianity broadcast. If you're interested in more information about this week's topic, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For a thorough investigation of the reliability of the New Testament Gospels and the case for Christianity, be sure to purchase Cold Case Christianity. A homicide detective investigates the claims of the Gospels. It's available wherever books are sold.